Who had fun at the quiz? I know I did, because there is power in the ability to guess when you don't know the answer. And I still came in, got 11 out of 20. So that's not bad, right? I love a quiz. Can't have a nerdy event without quizzes, right? Who doesn't love a quiz? Next we'll have Dungeons and Dragons, right? If they haven't done a what the fuck is event yet of D&D, they probably should. So it's a free-for-all for cosplay. Welcome, everyone. We are in the final hours of What the Fuck is Cloud Native? We are very grateful to our sponsors. It's a lot of fun being here. I hope you're having fun. This should be an easy one to join. I hope you enjoy, because I think the panel is the thing that translates best in the virtual world. That translates pretty much the same. So I'm really proud to have my guests with me today. We're going to talk about what the fuck is cloud native, especially in well-regulated environments, but in general, because that's our theme today. So first, I would love for you each to introduce yourself. Anne, you look dope. Go first. Everyone looks dope as fuck. It's awesome. So Anne, if you'd like to introduce yourself first and what you think cloud native is. I love a definition.
Yeah, dope, but completely blind. I cannot see a damn thing. But anyway.
Me neither. It's okay.
So my name is Anne Currie. I worked with container solutions for years and years. And I've been an engineer and an engineering manager and various other things there. In the last year, I ran the first ever tech ethics course for the University of Hertfordshire, and I'm part of the leadership team of the Green Software Foundation. So that's me. Oh, and what do I think cloud native is? I wrote a book for this. How the first time I met Container Solutions was I had to write a book where I went to talk to loads of people who were doing cloud native about what it actually meant, and I had no idea. And I really thought it was all about efficiency, but in the end, what seemed to be the defining feature was that it was that people had a high feature velocity. And they did it because they perceived an existential threat against their existing business model, but they didn't necessarily know which one to move to. So for me, cloud native is about change.
And do you know what year that was that you wrote that book?
Oh, blimey, what year was that? I can't remember if it was 2016 or 2017.
And has that definition changed at all, or you think that's quite consistent?
I think that's quite consistent. Yeah, I mean, I think it will evolve into the use of cloud services, and I think that that clouds and being cloud native will play an enormous part in the transition to renewable zero carbon infrastructure. But that's what's going to happen next.
Hopefully, or the world will.
Oh,
whatever.
It will happen. There's no hope
for the solution. I'm just going by my view of Zoom. So Daniel, you're next. Please introduce yourself and say what you think cloud native is.
Hello, everyone. So I'm head of DevRel at Ambassador Labs, Daniel Bryant. Background is very much in the Java space. And if we're plugging books, I will just do a subtle point back here. So there is a definition of cloud native in that book as well. I wrote with Abraham, my buddy. Background in ops and solution architecture and a bunch of other things as well. Now I'm all about the DevRel. What is cloud native? Great question. There's the obvious technical answers, right? Microservices, elastic scalability, on-demand compute, all that good stuff. But I'm going to lean into something I think Anne was hinting at as well. It's more about a movement, I think, these days, right? Being able to move at speed or velocity with safety. That's my idea. Come up with hypotheses, quickly get the ideas out there, test them, get that feedback loop going. It's arguably like, continuous delivery, a bunch of other things in this space are very similar, but I think we're looping in cloud native now to be almost a movement of speed and safety for delivering software.
Thank you very much, Daniel and Epic Hat. Aubrey with the beautiful mask, please introduce yourself and say what you think cloud native is.
Well, hey, I'm Aubrey Stearn, an interim CTO by trade. I spent the day talking about the strangler pattern, and I feel like the thing that's strangling me is this mask. What is cloud native? I want to lead on the technical answer a little bit and say it's an environment where, we're pretty much guaranteed that everything around us is going to fail at some point. So we factor that into how we design and build in that environment. And it means that I think ultimately we end up with more robust architecture and software. We end up applying some really similar patterns, which means we can go and break off bits of our application and replace them later when it makes sense, or do something interesting with it. And it's largely a way of working. We conflate, I think, a lot of technologies and ways of working with this, and it's maybe that's not a bad thing. But for me, it's a particular way of building applications and creating, I guess, to lean on Anne and Daniel's point, the right outcomes for an organization.
It's not necessarily a bad thing. It's not necessarily an easy thing either, is it?
No, not at all.
And Ian, with the brightest colored goggles I've seen today, please introduce yourself and say what you think cloud native is.
Sure. Happy to be here. My name is Ian. I'm CTO at Container Solutions. I have a background in software development in a bunch of different industries. And then I've done a few different roles at Container Solutions, basically looking at helping organizations become cloud native. So you would think I would have a good idea of what cloud native is. After watching this conference so far, I think though it has something to do with steampunk. I didn't realize that before. But I think basically what I see it as, it's how we leverage the technologies that come with cloud, right? This idea of unlimited compute and capacity that's kind of available to us, and then how we leverage that to create resilient systems, etc. And then what's really interesting is that the cultural aspects and the organizational aspects that have come with that, and that have been kind of a requirement if you want to actually leverage these technologies.
And I'm Jenniferiggins. I've been here all day, but I'm a tech storyteller. I freelance a lot, including for the New Stack and Container Solutions, and I help translate, hopefully, the future of tech and the culture side of tech. I'm not technical at all, well, except literally physically right now. And I hate the word cloud native. Why? Because I think it's deeply problematic as a word. I think native is part of the problem because it implies you need to be a Monzo or a company that is built in the cloud. And it has the word cloud in it. And I don't think any company wants to be fully cloud, because you need things on-prem, you need things on the edge. It's going to change all the time. So I like the idea of cloud native. I like the discussion, especially around the culture intersecting with the tech and the processes, because I do a lot in agile space and DevOps as well. But I think it's a stupid name. But that's just my opinion at a cloud native conference that I'm hosting. Okay, so why is that? So what are some of the different challenges about adopting the cloud native mindset, technical track, and the processes in regulated industries?
Shall I go? I don't mind going. I be like, I want to clear. Yeah, let's do it. So I've done quite a few regulated industries. I would consider like fintech and banking probably my trade these days. And I think what is the challenge in adopting it? You had a regulatory position a while ago with some of the regulators was really uncomfortable with things like system of record being in the cloud, and you had a situation where challengers were able to go and put their system of record in the cloud because they had no records. So it was an easy one for people to get shortcut rules to say you can operate this way. All of our CMA 9s had to operate another way. So all of those Unisys, Fujitsu, IBM mainframes, they carried on having to operate and have their abstraction layers in front. That made things somewhat difficult to take advantage of some of the cloud. Our regulators were also historically very nervous about how much data was put on the cloud, and their, I think, ability to evaluate that and maybe their maturity in evaluating whether things were suitable for cloud wasn't where it should have been. I think that has largely changed now, but there is still some catch up to do. As for organizational adoption, is it a challenge? I think lots of people want to centralize things in big organizations and say, this is your domain. I think that is very challenging when creating agility, especially in the cloud. When we want to move fast, we want to break things, we're designing for an environment that absolutely will fail. We want to look at that scalability. It's very hard to do that sort of thing when you have maybe a centralized pipeline and that goes through a particular team and you can't go and adjust to that. You can't adopt those new technologies, or every new technology that you need to adopt has to go through procurement, and it's not covered by, maybe it might be covered by your SA agreement, but then it has to go through your governance process and whatnot. And I think adapting to that agility that we can go and find doesn't absolutely hold up right now in those big organizations. They haven't adapted. I think that's something we're still working on. I can carry on forever, but I want to clear the floor for somebody else who's had time to think.
And Anne, I think you had something to say, but also, do all organizations have to be cloud native to be successful, or does the whole organization have to be cloud native to be successful?
Oh, well, that's an interesting question. But I will ask your answer. I'll try and talk about your initial question, which is what are the difficulties of regulated industries? I think one of the main difficulties that regulated industries are usually established and successful. And if you're established and successful, you've got a lot to lose. And your business is usually set up not to change in a dangerous way. It's that it resists dangerous change. So unless they think they're a real risk, which they probably don't yet think, some of them do, some of them don't. Unless that's really grokked within the organization, they're not going to want to make a change like that.
So they're successful and established and thus risk adverse. So it makes them
in the middle. It's the classic frozen middle.
Daniel?
I was going to add, there's a lot of departments of no in regulated environments, right? And I totally get it, right? You said it perfectly, Anne. Like that is optimizing for safety over than speed more often than not, right? And how you incentivize people, I'm sure we're going to touch on this a lot in the discussion, but how you incentivize folks is how they'll generally react. And if you're penalized for, shipping something and breaking it, to Aubrey's point, you're not going to do that, right? You're going to put up barriers, you're going to do everything you can. And the beauty of a regulated industry is there's nice lot of rules you can point to. In a department of no, you can say no, because rule number 1. No, because rule number 10, right? And you can just go through the rules. So it's a gift and a curse, the regulated environment, I think.
Fair enough. A gift and a curse is a good way to balance everything, right? Ian, let's talk about the cultural side. You deal with a lot of organizations, and yes, you're CTO, but so much of the cloud native is about implementing a cultural change. So how does that happen or not?
I think that's a good question. That's something that we tackle constantly, right? How do you make the cultural change happen? Being an external consultancy and coming in under a mandate of transforming a company, that's kind of the big thing which needs to happen, right? The technology side of things is, there are challenges, right? In setting up a large Kubernetes-based platform and automating all the things. But relatively so, that's easy compared to actually getting a cultural change going in place. There's no set of YAML files that we can put in to create a psychologically safe environment. There's not a tool in the CNCF landscape that I can use to create a learning organization. So I think that's the fact that the cultural change is really what's going to be the big driver of actually impacting the business results which you're looking for. One of the things also being a kind of a consultancy, we're lucky in the sense that when we come in, the first big hurdle is already taken care of, right? The fact that a company reaches out to us to look for help, they've already recognized that they need help and they want change. They may not recognize it's cultural, but that's usually a step which is easily passed. So that's the big first step, is understanding that we need to have change and we need to stop doing the things that we're doing. The other side is the why, right? Like it needs to be tied into your business goals of why you want to have this cultural change in place. And it needs to come from the top, right? They are, it can start as kind of a grassroots thing of certain teams or departments really trying to bring in a cultural change, but ultimately it needs to have buy-in from the top level or it's not going to get that much traction. And I think the final thing is about translating that to action, right? When we talk about culture, it's about the things that you do, not the things that you say. So even, having all the top levels talking about this is a new culture we want and we need to be experimental, etc. you're often fighting against a large inertia of the existence of that company. We're talking about a case like this recently with an organization, and all the top level management saying all the right things, really understood that they wanted to become experimental and look at that Horizon 2, Horizon 3 stuff and transmitting this message to everybody. But the entire company itself and its history and everything that was set up was still incentivizing their old way of working. So that's why that gap exists. So you really need to start with the actions. And that's where the tooling can help, right? If you use this as a gateway of bringing in these technologies, and if we want to leverage it, we have to adjust the ways that we work. That's where that can start to help, and where the technology kind of fits in and can make it easier to do cultural change.
So that whole time, our parents growing up, I don't know about y'all, but saying, do as I say, not as I do, was actually just bad example. Bad parenting, probably.
They messed us up.
Just a follow-up question, because you said there's no CNCF protocol or project about the cultural side. And this is kind of open to everyone. Should there be something where we are open sourcing cultural change and creating standards for psychological safety, for example?
Is it possible? I think the stuff is local. Would it help? I don't know. I mean, if you look at the original paper that Spotify threw out on what they were doing with the matrix model in disguise, right? Did that help? Or did that just make some big consultancies a lot of money? That would be my position.
Fair enough. Yeah.
I tend to agree that every company is different. And I've worked with lots of companies making various changes, because I was a consultant for a long time. And people want change, they bring in consultants. And a lot of the resistance is perfectly reasonable, in that the middle managers have all been burned by the often new upper management who don't know how the business works, and they don't know what's safe, what's not safe. They don't really understand how everything works, and therefore they're very distrustful of some crazy idea that people have heard on that their CEO is brought back from the golf course. And they're right to distrust that, because they have their job to lose, and they quite often love the company. It's the classic case of a whistleblower is somebody who usually genuinely cares about the company they're blowing the whistle on. That people who stop change often really care about the company and don't want to harm it, and they don't really trust that the upper management know what they're asking for. So it's difficult.
Mm-hmm. Daniel, you're nodding so fast your hat will fly.
yeah, totally. Aubrey and Anne have nailed it. One example I would say that is somewhat successful is the PayPal inner source movement. They talked a lot about how to do inner source properly. I remember, I think it's Diane, I've forgotten her surname, but I saw a talk in a New York conference a while back. And there was a set of technology practices around this is how you run an open source project internally. But there was also a sort of open source practice, if you like, about how you expand internally and further afield with inner source. And I think just for probably folks watching in this group, that inner source in itself is quite interesting, particularly like in a regulated environment. How do I open source, inner source, various tooling? But it was probably the best example I've seen where the advice was concrete enough that you could follow it and useful enough, or sort of generic enough to be sort of useful, if that makes sense. Because I totally agree with what Aubrey said, like most of the stuff is context specific, or like Spotify model only works for Spotify, like you're missing the context. If you bring it, we'll use squads, chapters and guilds, right? Yeah, it makes it all right, which we know it doesn't. So I think, the inner source model from PayPal is the best example I've seen, and it was deliberately lightweight and had lots of guidance around context, almost like patterns, right? This is the context where you should apply this thing.
Mm-hmm. Daniel, because I love a definition for those listening, can you quickly define inner source or in source?
So it's more like, it's like open source, but internally would be my definition. And I've heard a few different definitions. So
not a very good definition. How would you?
I can't remember the exact definition of PayPal. I encourage folks to Google or search, for inner source PayPal. They've got a much better definition than me.
Okay. We have an interesting question from the audience. Has cloud native essentially come to mean it must use containers, and is that ethical? I mean, Anne, I use the E word. You can start.
Well, that's like, are containers ethical? That's really quite a I don't think it has to. I don't think you have to orchestrate yourself in order to be cloud native. I don't think you have. Well, I mean, almost the implication of, so containers obviously have a rapid packaging functionality, and they also have an operational functionality. You can move things around, and you can use your resources effectively when things are containerized. So there's a green ethical element to containerization, because it's easier to orchestrate, and it's then easier to get high machine utilization, which is what we're going to need in the new green world. But is it other than that, would I consider you to be unethical if you weren't using containers? Not particularly. It's a very interesting question, that. Do I consider it to be ethical to basically force people to use containers? I think it would be okay. I don't think it's the case, but even if it was the case, I don't think it would be terrible, because at least containers are open source, so they don't cost you anything. So I think it's probably all right.
But that's interesting for you to say open source doesn't cost you anything, because, and does not everything cost the environment something?
Well, we can go into a totally separate discussion about whether open source is good for the environment. And it really isn't as good for the environment as you might hope, because efficiency is not usually one of the goals of open source software, and it needs to be in the future. With Daniel's, Daniel is a total expert in service meshes, and they're one of the biggest culprits of using too much CPU.
Let's move on to the topic of security then. How do you manage security, especially in, well, everywhere security matters. Everywhere at this point, pretty much every company is handling personal data. So security fucking matters. So what the fuck do you do? How do you deal with that? I love this conference. I don't get this fun elsewhere where I get to use this. Aubrey, you have the most.
Yeah. I'll jump in, come up with the quick answer. So security was an interesting one for me, because the cadence of engineering is usually driven by the business and by your competition, and it spins at a certain pace, whereas security is almost wholesale external. And so the cadence for that is a completely different spin rate from what your engineering innovation sits at. It's an easy one for me to go and talk to the business about, because you talk the language of risk, material risk, and reputational risk, and it's quite easy to go to your CFO and say, well, how much will losing one customer cost, and what does it cost to damage our reputation, and how irreparable is that? These are all conversations I find relatively easy to have and create time and space for engineering. The challenge I think that we have is, again, in those large organizations, we have that siloing of operations. So we centralize security, we centralize our build pipelines and tooling, and I think that is not good. I think it leads to, probably for me personally, the wrong outcome. I think it can work for some folks. I think there is always advantages to having folks spend a particular amount of time on this. And if you look at those blue and red and purple models, I'm not sure purple's great. I think those are folks that largely almost mirror historical security, where they give you advice but don't do it. I've always been a big proponent of my security folks cutting code and committing with us, and the same with people that would suggest controls to you. I would want those people to go and write those controls into code and write the attestation that those actually work. And largely, I mean, that's obviously something I've spoken extensively about. I think we lack a language to do that at the moment. I think we lack the ability to express what we expect and to create attestation for that. There is nothing that will do that. But security, yeah, always an interesting one. We have a lot of tooling that can help folks, and I think give them assistance and upskill them. But largely, if you can't move from your lane, if you are just an engineer in a big organization and you can't move sideways and look at tool chain and look at infrastructure and look at holistically the same way we treat operationally owning your platform and operational excellence, if you can't move into that space, you're as good as your narrow view of the road ahead, right? So I think it's really about creating space for those folks to branch out and to start looking more holistically at the thing that they're building and how they do that. And again, it all starts from shifting left and earlier with that what is threat analysis? How do we, what is my vector of attack here? How can I slim that down? At what point, am I going to be attacked? And then you can go even deeper into that zero trust question, which is, I don't trust my platform. How do we counter that? And then you head off into the world of Intel SGX extensions and homomorphic encryption and all the interesting things happening in that space.
Ian, when is security brought into that cloud native transformation discussion with clients?
Not as early as it needs to be. I think I'm not a big fan of the shift left as a term, but it implies the same thing. Same thing with DevSecOps, right? The general idea of the golem is to get us thinking about security from the beginning. And as Aubrey was mentioning, of not having engineers just responsible for their thing and security teams responsible for another, because it lacks that education, right? Where as an engineer, I'm building a platform and building software. I need to be thinking about that from the very beginning and understanding what are the real threats, and not just what's the checklist that some security team has created that I need to tick off. And on the other side as well, it's if you have these isolated security teams, and especially thinking in a regulated industry, they've got these regulations which come in, and then they create, you have compliance offers which put together, okay, these are the things that we need to, again, check off our list so that we're compliant with these kinds of things, without actually understanding the technology that's involved or what's the actual goal. And I think education goes really far on both sides to trying to achieve what's there. And part of that is starting that conversation from the beginning.
Okay, so that's a perfect transition into our next question of how do you make the most out of the inevitable failures in your cloud native transformation process? Who wants to take that one? Security being a big one, I'm sure.
I have a go starting that one. One thing I was going to say is retrospectives. I was thinking as Ian was talking there, like we're Ambassador Labs to have an API gateway, and we're increasingly bumping into folks asking us to do show threat models and show our diligence and filling out security questionnaires, but they also ask, how do you deal with incidents, right? And we've got this extensive post-mortem playbook we run. We've got automation involved to capture Slack channels and things like that. And it's been super useful, right? Capturing all the Slack channel chatter, diagnostic logs if something's gone wrong, and then having a proper, honest, some folks call them blameless, postmortems, but I think honest postmortems is good because sometimes there is blame, right? Like the system went wrong, or I fat fingered something, right? We've all been there, I'm sure, in production, right? So these things happen, right? So it's not about blaming someone, but it's like if ultimately that was the problem, well, how do we mitigate that in the future? It's having honest postmortems. So I look a lot to Nora Jones in the Jelly folks. They've got some amazing websites, learningfromincidents.com, I think it is, or learningfromincidents.io. I've learned a lot from the Gremlin folks like Tammy and Colton. They've got some amazing playbooks to run game days and also incident and response and postmortems. So you've got to diagnose the thing, whether you like the term, blameless postmortem or not. You've got to diagnose what happened and learn from your mistakes. And you're nodding along.
Oh, I am nodding along. I was immediately, Daniel, that immediately made me think about chaos engineering and its part in being in the cloud. So Daniel, I know you have opinions on this.
Chaos engineering, Anne?
Yep.
Yeah, probably the same as you, to be fair. As in, I do I think we've all touched on it earlier on in terms of the shifting left. It is a bit of a strange term, but even things like chaos engineering, designing for failure, designing for resilience, as I think Aubrey said up front, is really key. And it's a lot of things to think about up front. But if you can bake in these, what do you call them, fitness functions or automation, things that test your assumptions. And I think chaos engineering is one of those things, right? If you look back to the classic Chaos Monkey with Amazon, it was like, you should be designing systems that, tolerate dependencies disappearing. And the way you codify that and automate that is actually do it. the Chaos Monkey would randomly, stop a VM or kill a dependency. And if your system fell over, well then, hey, we've tested that you didn't actually codify those things in your system early on. So yeah, love the chaos engineering stuff. And I think it's not super mainstream yet because people do get a bit nervous about embracing failure, just think at all levels of the business. But I do like the concepts behind chaos engineering.
Also, it's another poorly named thing that scares people. So does postmortem, because death. But who am I to judge today?
Well, they improved it because they made a huge they made a huge effort to change the name from Chaos Monkey to Chaos Engineering, which at least is broadly acceptable as a topic for discussion. So, but you're right, the names do make a difference. So when it was called Chaos Monkey, they couldn't get any traction on it at all from CEOs, but it did become more acceptable once it was called Chaos Engineering.
Which is crazy, because who doesn't love a monkey? People are anomalies.
CEOs don't love monkeys. They're miserable.
Losers. We have a question from the audience that I think is actually a really good way as we start to wind down. It's quite broad, but I'm sure you have a penumbra of answers and resources for it. How best can I get started with cloud native? Any resources? And I would add to that, if you're within a company, if you're just a peon, not a leadership, how do you get started? Where do you get started in influencing the cloud native culture?
Got to be able to code. Got to be able to code. If you're focused on raw infrastructure, which I think is a dying trend, and I think if you're going down that path of die hard wanting to stick with just infra, you're going to be in a world of just working for probably like 8 people in the world at some point in their data centers that are for everybody else. But I think you want to move towards a hybrid role of being able to I wouldn't say T-shape. I would like people to move towards M-shaped engineers, people with multiple vertical depths that span that wide horizontal, that can tell a coherent story across the spectrum of building software. And that is from building back-end services and front-end services and deploying them on the cloud and building the infrastructure to go and do that. Where can you learn it? Codecademy is great. My girlfriend is learning from that at the moment and learning how to code, and she's having a really great success with that. She's gone to a ton of meetups, and I think those have been really successful for her. A lot of really good collaborative groups out there that will run projects together and squad up. I think that's been super useful to experience that. There is, Christ, forgot the service now. Trust me, there's a couple of services out there that will go and teach you step by step how to go and get your qualifications in the cloud, like if you want to go down that route. And they're also quite good for generally just learning how these things work. Would I say that you should read the documentation for a particular cloud? Yeah, not the best place to learn from usually when you're stuck. But I think there's also really great labs from all the cloud providers where you can go on and just try something out and get going in their sort of crafted lab and experience something. Which one would you start on? Oh, I'm going to offend some people now for sure. If you're hardcore, go AWS. And if you're wanting accessibility and you're coming from that enterprise background, definitely go with Azure. You spin an AKS cluster up is like one block of code in Terraform versus the mountain that you'd have to go and do in AWS to get EKS running. And then there's GCP, which is a lot better than it used to be. That's my answer.
Ian, do you have some resources? Thank you so much, Aubrey. And if you think of those courses later, or those certifications, let us know, of course. There's always time to continue learning. Ian, what would you suggest? Where to get started?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I think the first thing I would think of is, defining a little bit more what's your goal, right? Like getting into cloud native, what's your kind of end goal? Are you looking for in terms of career, where you want to progress? Think about that, what kind of role is, maybe find somebody in a role that you're interested in and talk to them. I think there's so many resources out there to learn different things, and people that are really willing to help and learn. That's one thing I've really found a lot in this space. People are generally really helpful. So don't be afraid to reach out. One of the pieces of advice I would give is focus on concepts over specific tools. Like definitely get into the hands-on and find some specific tools. If I want to learn about service meshes is important, and definitely pick one maybe and do some hands-on stuff, but try and focus on more of the concepts and the tools. The tools are going to change, but the concepts stay more or less the same.
And then as employers, you should be looking for people that understand the concepts and have flexibility with tools, not looking for a eager list of necessary tools that aren't really necessary.
100%. Because yeah, like this CNCF landscape, this changes all the time, right? So it's you need people who are able to learn rather than have specific experience with tools.
And what would you add to that? Thank you, Ian.
So I both Ian and Aubrey both answered really well there. I'll try and cover it from a different perspective, which is a lot what we've talked about there is how do you learn the skills? How do you learn to do it? But Ian mentioned why. What's the purpose? Is it to increase feature velocity? Well, you probably start with your CI/CD stuff. Start looking into that. Is it to go greener? Because actually the clouds are generally greener. It's quite a good place to go if you want to reduce your carbon footprint. Is it because you need something that's more reliable? What's your motive? And then you can go and start from there. Start from the why. What's your motive for thinking about the cloud? If it's just because it's a career move for you, then you should probably think about actually changing jobs. You need to demonstrate that you enjoy learning and that you could learn in that new environment. But you're not, until you actually do it, until you get your hands dirty, you're not really going to learn the technical skills. Side projects and things don't really tell you enough. But think about why you're doing it. What's your reason?
Asking why is always very good. My friend Divya, actually, she couldn't get her work to really buy into the cloud native. She works for a very well-regulated industry. And so granted, she has the freedom of someone who's single and has the time and all, but she is a CNCF ambassador now. She has spent the last 2 years really contributing to open source. So if you have the time and capacity, which we recognize not everyone does, you really can just work insanely and contribute to open source projects to get that way. But I'm not saying that's for everyone, and it's exhausting, or it's for the young, for certainly. Daniel, what would you like to add to that?
Yeah, these been, as Anne said, fantastic suggestions all around. And I'm a big fan of focusing on the why. I think, as Ian first said, I'd match it to your persona as well. Like if you're an engineer, like skills, like if you can afford it or convince your company, grab something like O'Reilly subscription, plural site subscription, Code Cloud, there's some free ones there as well. And they are great, I think, for bootstrapping like core skills. Next level up, I'd sort of look at things like the DevOps Handbook. It's a second edition coming out now, I think. And anything by Gene Kim is awesome. It's not always cloud specific, but things like the Phoenix project and Unicorn project are timeless, and you'll map a lot of the change problems to your context. Most people, as they read like the Phoenix project, they're nodding along. If they work in a big industry, they're nodding along going, yes, I recognize this problem. And then I've always got to shout out Camille Fournier's work, like managing a manager's path. I think if you're looking to drive change and you're at that kind of level, like knowing how to manage and lead effectively is really a core skill. And then I think like if you're sort of like C-level, it's really about educating yourself. And as Aubrey mentioned, like popping along to the clouds, I think is good. Reading some of their material around the edges, like the AWS well-architected framework is actually quite a nice introduction to how to design a good architecture in the cloud. And Azure have got something similar as well. And they've got related like sort of transformation material. So circling around the clouds and picking out interesting topics, interesting ebooks is good advice, I think, too.
Thank you so much. And I hope some of those expensive resources have some sort of diversity scholarship program or something that provide people with those resources that maybe can't afford an O'Reilly subscription. I also want to share from the audience, Anonymous said, love the resources from Ayar Zilberman, Pinky Bunny Ears, and on GitHub, that's EYARZ. And also there's Root Song JC, awesome cloud native. I'm going to start a thread on Twitter so all of y'all can just throw all those ideas, if you remember them, that you just spilled out to me. Thank you all so much. And I hope everyone enjoys figuring out what the fuck cloud native is. I'll see y'all in a few minutes at Manuel Pais's Team Topologies. Thanks, y'all.